Good morning. We got 6 chapters of Joshua to maybe try to look at today, combining yesterday's readings of 4 through 6 and today of 7 through 9. And chapter 4 starts out just right after the entire nation of Israel has crossed over or through the river Jordan. I mean, they weren't in the water, but they were on dry land. They crossed the river anyway, and then Joshua is instructed to select 12 men and have each of these men, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, grab a stone from in the river by where the priest has stood with the Ark of the Covenant, and to take those stones and to make an altar on the other side in the land of Gilgal, where they are going to. And in verse 9, and my Bible has got this kind of in parentheses, that Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the river as well, as a reminder that this is where they stood. And, it says in the Bible, these stones remain there to this day. Well, now, however many thousands of years, or not thousands, but hundreds of years later, whether they're still there or not is questionable if they're stacked up or not. But they made an altar with 12 stones that they had taken from the river, as a reminder that this is where God had performed this miracle and had given them safe passage. And it was always a reminder that way. And after all the people had gone across, the priests then went across. Verse 10 says, the priests who bore the ark had remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was finished. So the men had carried the rocks out. Joshua had made his pile of rocks, and then they came out. And then in verse 13, it says about 40,000 armed for war had crossed over, to the plains of Jericho for battle. So they had, Israel had 40,000 men armed and prepared, for protection, if nothing else. But of course, they didn't need that. And when they got across the river, they put the stones up as a reminder, and it says, in verse 21 that, teach your children. When your children asks, what do these stones mean? Remind them, teach them. Remind them of the goodness of God and of the power of God, that the river, that all of people crossed here on dry ground. And then we get into chapter 5, and it says when the king of the Amorites had seen what had happened, he says their hearts melted. They were hearts melted. I mean, they were filled with fear, and trembling. And it says there was no longer any spirit in them. And then the first thing that happens after the nation of Israel has crossed over is that all of the males, period, not just children, are circumcised, because that was something that the Israelites had not been doing when they were in the wilderness. So all of the men from age 1 to age, basically 40, because of those that had been born in those time, were circumcised. And then it says after they were healed from that, then Joshua said, Lord said, today I have rolled away from you the desolation of Egypt. I have set you free, and you remember now that you are free people. And this was, this was like on the 10th day of the month, and the 14th day of the month was the day of the Passover. So the Israelites celebrated their first Passover now in the Promised Land. And in verse 12 it says, or verse 11, basically, that very day they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain for the Passover, and that day the manna ceased. And the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land that year. So think about that. For 40 years, God had been faithful and taken care of those needs. And so then Joshua was by Jericho, and he sees this man standing beside him, and he kneels down before, and it is an angel of the Lord who is going to be the commander of the army of the Lord for the people of Israel. And he says, remove your sandals, for this is a holy place. And this, the instructions now then came to Joshua as to how to take the city of Jericho. And, this is a walled city with, tremendous tremendously tall walls built up and fortified, and places for archers and everybody to protect it, from any armies. And God says this is how it's going to work. Take these men and take these priests, and there was 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of the ram's horn before the ark. Make 1 trip a day around the city of Jericho. So I don't know how long it took them to get around there, and then he said and make no sounds. But then on the 7th day, go around it 7 times and blow the trumpets and raise a shout, and boom, and the walls will come down. And this is what happened. I mean, God was faithful in his promise. The walls came down, it said, and the Israelite soldiers went in and utterly destroyed everyone in the city, which was what God had told them to do. And the Israelites then took possession of the city of Jericho and the land around it. As they were going to go into the city and take possession of it, Joshua said to those 2 spies who had gone in, he says, go find Rahab, who protected you, and make sure that she and everyone in her house come out safely. And so this promise that Rahab had sought from these 2 spies, she hung that crimson rope there. She was faithful in what she said, and Joshua and God in turn were faithful then to Rahab. And verse 25 of chapter 6 is, but Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joseph spared. And her family has lived in Israel ever since. So another way of being faithful to your promise. And when someone helps you out, stay true to who they are. And chapter 7 starts out, but the Israelites broke faith in regard to the devoted things. And so some of the Israelites had plundered and taken things that they shouldn't have, that God had said, do not take these things. God had given them specific instructions. He was faithful in letting them utterly destroy the city. But he says, don't do these certain things, and they did. And God's anger was kindled on them. Here they are, just, hardly, how many days have they been in the promised land? 7 days it took them to capture the city Jericho, and they'd been there for a little while because of the circumcision and everything, but just boom, here God had provided this miracle of passage over the Jordan River, and then they don't listen to him. And God's anger is kindled against them, it says. And so then Joshua was going to send, and Joshua wasn't aware of this, and he sent then some soldiers up against the city of Ai. And what happens there? It's not a successful battle. It says 36 of Joshua's men are killed, and they come running back with their tails between their legs. They have failed. And it says, the hearts of the people melted and turned to water. So, they lost their courage, and they didn't understand why. And then it says, Joshua tore his clothes and fell on his face before the ark of the Lord. And it says, he and the elders put dust on their heads. It's showing, again, their reliance upon God, and they're knowing that. And Joshua asks, why did you do this? Why did this happen? And God says, because some have not been faithful. And he says, Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I imposed upon them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They did exactly what they weren't supposed to do. Did you ever do that as a kid? Do something your parents said, no? Or have your kids done that? Yeah, we've all been there. We know how hard it is always to listen and to follow orders. And, sometimes things just look so good. But anyway, God does end up saying to Joshua, I'm going to deliver the city of Ai to your hands. And He says, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to set up an ambush. You take all these men and you set up an ambush and you send a few guys up there, and as they start to turn tail and run again, and the army of Ai comes out after you, I will deliver them into your hands. And that happens just again, as the Lord had said to Joshua and to the people. And when that happens, I mean, they have this amazing victory again. And then the kings of the other surrounding communities, the other cities and countries, they had probably didn't have real big countries, big areas that they held, but they were all in fear and in awe of Joshua and the Israelites. And one group in particular, from the city of Gibeon, heard about this, and they sent messengers. They sent someone there to work out a peace treaty, basically, to speak of. And they said, we live in a land long way away, and we'd like to make peace with you. Well, they weren't very far away anyway, but they misrepresented themselves. Ever heard about that? Yep. But anyway, the Israelites made this covenant then with these people. And then these other 5 kings came together, put their armies all together to come against Israel. And Israel was successful against them, just as God had promised, and God led them. And when that happened, then Joshua finds out about these people of Gibeon, that, hey, they don't live so awfully far away. And he comes and he says, why did you deceive us? Why did you lie to us? Why did you come and make this covenant with us? And they said, because we were afraid that you would conquer us too. And now if you let us live within your land, we will be your servants and whatever. And so then as we finished chapter 9, it says, on that day Joshua made them hewers of wood, woodworkers, carpenters, and drawers of water for all of the people. So this then became the occupations of these people from this city, this community of Gibeon, who had made a treaty under false pretenses, but yet Joshua honors the treaty, lets them live peacefully among them, gives them something to do, and so then they become a viable and valuable part of the community. And one of the ways, just one more of the way that God served and protected his people of Israel. So tomorrow, and we'll start again in chapter 10 and go on from there. God's blessings again today for you all.